Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Michał Rutkowski, and I'm Global Director for Social Protection and Jobs in the World Bank. Thank you very much for coming here to the event, which is a launch of a guide to navigating concepts, evidence, and practices of the universal basic income. You all noticed, and your presence here actually gives a testimony to that. The UBI has become one of the hottest social policy topics in recent years. What makes it unique is that it is supported by some very right-wing people and by some very left-wing people, which seldom happens. It is proposed for very high-income countries or areas, but it's also proposed for low-income countries and areas for different reasons. So it's really hot, and I am very proud of the team that wrote the guide. We have authors and editors here in the room, including behind this table. And I think the only thing I would like to say is actually borrowed from one of them, that UBI is a bit like Google. When you look at it first time, it's like this beautiful white page, very simple, very neat. Nothing can get lost there. The moment you put something in the subject line, it suddenly grows in enormous complexity. There is everything out there. And this is more or less the UBI world. The more you go into that, the more complicated, unclear, ambiguous, with all shades of gray it is. And this is why having a guide like the one we are launching today is really, really important, so that we can communicate well, so that we don't compare apples and oranges, so that we know what we are talking about, and a lot of credit goes to the team. We start by opening remarks by Margaret Grosz, who is a senior advisor in our Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice, and who is also a co-author and co-editor of the book. And her opening remarks will be followed by the main presentation of Ugo Gentilini, our global lead for social safety nets, and also co-editor and co-author of the book. Margaret will have up to 5 minutes. Ugo would have 20-25. And after this, I will introduce to you our stellar panel, which will help us understand the guide to navigate concepts of UBI. Margaret.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want to speak a moment. So Michal said that there are very many things already written about UBI, and that big explosion of interest. So in contrast to, think back when you were doing your thesis or your dissertation, you picked some topic that hardly anybody had worked on so you could make the contribution and not be overshadowed. We chose the opposite strategy of working exactly where there was so much interest. So we had to so partly that was to do our homework and to help the bank do its homework, to think, what do we think about this topic? But we particularly tried to look at it in a very open-minded point of view and to say, how does this fit in the toolkit we have? We have a toolkit of social protection instruments and safety nets instruments, and they have lots of different designs, and we use them in lots of different contexts. So is this the vice grip to our pliers, our hammer, and our screwdriver? Where does this fit in that panoply? And so we came with a great deal of curiosity. We tried to put some order in it. I would say among the team, we had initially slightly different nuances of skepticism versus enthusiasm for the idea, but really we wanted to be very practical and very kind of open-minded, and with a focus on World Bank client countries as opposed to the sort of higher income debates. So to do that, Ugo put together a team of several of us. Among the co-editors, we have Ruslan here in the room. Yameli is connected from somewhere. And among the chapter leads, we have Teresa Terminacian back here. But you'll see in the team, we have the sort of core team of authors, some very illustrious people. Then we have all of the people who did background papers and research assistants, and some of those names aren't yet known to you, but they are of great ability as well, and clearly as they rise in their careers, you'll be familiar with those names. Of the people in that tier, the one I see is Vanessa here. But we have many people, and then we had a lot of peer reviewers, many debating partners, sparring partners, people that we gave seminars to in different ways, who are also very important in shaping the views, and of course our managers and formal advisors. So we want to thank all of those people who helped shape it, and of course the RSR trust fund that financed the work. But I do want to stress that this is an authored piece, and actually with different authors on different chapters. It is not the World Bank view on. There are, however many of us there are, 10,000, 15,000 people in the World Bank, and there are lots of different views, and we cannot pretend to represent that whole wide panoply of viewpoints, and this has certainly not been through an official endorsement process from the board. But we hope it will be of interest to you and very interesting. So with that, I will let Ugo take over.
Thank you so much, Margaret. So it's clear that in addition to being very rich, the debate on UBI is also very diverse. There are so many definitions of UBI out there. People refer to it with very different concepts in mind. I'm pretty sure if we take a survey of the room, there might be at least a dozen definitions popping up. As Michal said, how come that people from the left and the right tend to support it? Some see it as an instrument for social justice. Some see it as the instrument for social justice. Others, and I quote Piketty, see it as social justice on the cheap. There are so many proposals out there. We recorded 36 that vary so much in scope and detail that the discussion can, as Michal said, become a little bit confusing. So perhaps a good starting point is to shed light on those differences, trying to clarify them and reconciling them under a coherent framework. So the first question that one needs to ask is, what is the problem that UBI is trying to solve? And we have at least 3 narratives here, and each narrative does have implications for design choices, including the amount of cash to be provided. So some propose UBI as a way of countering the effects of automation on unemployment. This is a little bit a story coming out of Silicon Valley, but also of ex-union leaders like Annie Stern. Others see it as part of the dividend story. This is Marcelo Giugale, Shanta Devarajan, Todd Moss at CGD, done a lot of work and looking at countries that are abundant in natural resources, and they're suggesting that redistributing some of the revenues from those resources to the whole population could actually have an efficiency element, but also could be part of strengthening the social contracts, so the accountability. And then there is a third bucket, which is the core of the book, around non-contributory social transfers and how they fit into the wider social protection system. One interesting fact about UBI is that it's actually amazing how that same instrument is seen by some as a way of dismantling the state and strengthening it. So I'm proposing here a quote from Milton Friedman in a little-known piece he wrote for the National Review, March 67, where he's very candid about the UBI, the NIT, the negative income tax, something very similar, being a Trojan horse that would ultimately roll back the state. And on the other hand, we have, you may have heard of the social floor concept by the ILO. A number of people ask, how is that compatible with the UBI? It is compatible to the extent that you see UBI as something to build upon. And I would hazard perhaps that nowadays perhaps Charles Murray is espousing a little bit the views of Milton Friedman on the dismantling side. So very different rationales behind it. Now, how would you introduce a UBI? Also here, many different models. You could replace some of the programs. And here, though, the question is, how far do you go with replacement? Is it part of social assistance, all social assistance? Do you get into social insurance? What about services? So here the discussion is in part administrative and fiscal, but also ideological, as I mentioned earlier. Or a UBI could be a simple top-up to what exists. You don't substitute anything, it's in addition. Or you have the Yang model, that you provide here in the US, where he's proposing that let's give people choice on whether they want to go for a UBI in cash and forego the existing instruments, with the idea of creating sort of a market of public provision. So very different models as well. So, and if you take them all together, these different narratives, the different modes of introduction, they help explain why the proposals are so different out there. I think India, UBI is hotly debated, one of the countries where it is mostly hotly debated. And you see that the proposal by Feldman and others is like 5 times that of Joshi. Joshi is proposing a top-up. Others are looking at substitutional programs. Or you have Muralidharan, you have Ghatak, you have Ray before them, that propose, well, let's divide, let's take a share of GDP and redistribute it to everyone. A little bit social contract rationale that I mentioned. And being in India, of course, there are, again, the debate is very heated, having Chandres, Ghosh, Kira, Himanshu, and many others being very opposed to the idea per se. So in all this diversity, what we're trying to do with the book is to provide a thought process, a structured sort of thought process to think about the issues as you are considering UBI and if you're considering it. So try to understand first, how is your social protection system working? Why would you consider a UBI? What kind of objectives would you like to pursue? Set up the design parameters. How are you facing it in? Against what are you comparing it? Is it subsidies, the great work that David and Delphine Pradi did? Against what metrics, and here we lay out 8 of them, and then how you compare what exists with a possible UBI at program level and a system level. And this framework generally kind of mirrors the structure of the book as well with the different chapters. Now, what is a UBI exactly? It's a combination of three design choices. Fully universal, no conditions, entirely in cash. So if you take those 3 conditions and you map them out on a cube, each dimension of the cube being one of those features, you'll see that UBI sits on the bottom left corner, and you see how where the other social assistance instruments are located. But there are more characteristics. There is, in addition to these 3, so there is a regular payment, often on a monthly basis, equal amount to everyone, very important point to remember. So everybody gets the same amount, sometimes a little less for children. It's provided for individuals, not households. Some proposals are for adults only. A lot of debates on whether they should be for citizens or for residents. Let me zoom in for a second on the U of UBI, on what do we mean by universal. Also in this case, there are many definitions out there. One definition is in terms of outcomes. Governments want to achieve a certain outcome like get every kid to read. And you have different starting points and different interventions to help to get to that universal outcome. Or universality can be defined in terms of, well, no other eligibility criteria other than age. No income included. So that is the case with the universal child grants and universal social pensions. Or you can say it's for everybody, full stop. Transfers for everybody, full stop. So that's a classic definition of UBI. The moment that you include adults only, you will see that it quickly becomes a program targeted by age, so similar to universal child grants and pensions. Let me lay out 5 pros and cons of universality. We have reviewed the arguments against and for it in the book. So on one hand, on the positive side, may help address some of the exclusion and inclusion errors that are inherent in some of the needs-based measures. It may eliminate stigma. Everybody is a beneficiary. It could reduce transaction costs, the part of enrollment, eligibility, and generate, both for administrators and for beneficiaries, and generate psychological well-being for people, knowing that that stream of income is guaranteed. Labor compatibility, it only has an income effect. It doesn't have a price effect. The amount doesn't get reduced as incomes rise. And the possible political sustainability of it, all the discussion of more for the poor is less for the poor, involving the middle class would ensure more sustainability. On the other hand, there are fiscal and cost issues, as we will see, that can be substantial. The idea of giving everybody the same means that the poor and rich get the same. So if you prefer a more progressive distribution, that might be a concern. There is a lot of progress on reducing stigmas through new technology. Ale Marini is here from Greece. So it's not just a matter of universality. There is a lot of progress also on different interventions. The fact that there are limited disincentives is a common characteristic across programs, not just universality. And political sustainability, the chapter that Ruslan and Jürgen quoted, is quite complex. Are we talking about political economy of attitudes toward distribution, or the reform of programs that might be substituted, or the revenue mobilization, as Teresa indicated in her chapter? So a lot of the discussion when we talk about undercoverage on how to get to universal coverage focuses in terms of bottlenecks on the eligibility determination, which is an important debate to have, but it's just one among the many possible issues to consider. Funding, the moment that it's limited, they need to make choices. Being aware of the program by beneficiaries. We will talk more about the delivery bottlenecks from identification to payments and many others, the transaction costs. So part of the discussion in the book is to understand which of these bottlenecks UBI may help to overcome and which may actually amplify. So perhaps it would help around the eligibility determination and reducing transaction costs, but may amplify the fiscal challenges and put pressure on some of the delivery mechanisms. A parallel debate is, why are you giving transfers to everybody and why don't you give jobs to everybody? So this is something that also we reviewed, the experience with jobs guarantee programs. The state as a last sort employer, as an employer provider, what's the experience out there for anybody who wants to work at the minimum wage? So NREGA is one of those, and number of challenges from an administrative standpoint, and also on providing meaningful jobs on a rolling basis, quite a challenge. Now, we talk about universality from a benefits perspective. What happens when you increase taxes? So from a benefit perspective, UBI is very different from a guaranteed minimum income. Again, its benefits get reduced as incomes rise. But look, for example, at a proposal that is here for the US and this is a graph from GATEC. And you'll see that the moment that you include taxation, in this case VAT, some in the distribution become net payers, others net receivers. And then you end up with a net distribution of benefits that you could look at UBI as a mega GMI targeted via taxes. So very important to consider both sides of the story. It would take another hour just to go through these other debates, but just to mention that, like universality, we reviewed some of these big debates out there. Conditionality, there is a whole annex, and we looked at the different types of conditions and their effectiveness. The debate on transfer modalities, cash versus in-kind versus vouchers. Hirvonen and Hodinot had a very interesting paper last week. Plus, the employment, what do we know from existing evidence on employment? Francesca Passagli has a chapter on that. Does cash transfers induce mobility? What kind of design may promote or deter mobility? And inflation. You need to understand how well markets are integrated. If we turn very quickly to the experiences, I guess many of you have heard about UBI pilots, countries that have had the UBI in place. And this is great news, and it adds to the kind of debate and evidence base that we all have. But I'm listing here 18 experiences. Are all those 18 experiences a UBI as we define it in the first slides? Well, let's put them to test. If we look at just cash, they're all cash. I'm perhaps a little bit generous with the US negative income tax, but let's say they're all cash. Now, the moment, are they unconditional? Here, for example, the Netherlands is dropping out. The Utrecht experiments that involve conditionalities in various arms. Are they truly universal? Universe is shrinking here. Finland was for the unemployed. So you may have heard about Finland and the basic income grant. Is it national or is it just for a sub-region? Is it localized? Is it at city level? So we only have 5 experiences left. Does it provide regular payments? So Kuwait, Australia provided these one-off payments, very interesting from many perspectives, but it was kind of a one-off transfer. So we are left with 2 countries that ever had a UBI in place according to those parameters. And how many countries do you think have a UBI in place right now? Not many. None. As we speak, not a single country has a UBI in place. This doesn't mean that we're not learning a lot from all those experiences, and actually we are learning a lot. So let me just flesh out some of those lessons. One, Mongolia. This is a cautionary tale on when you get volatile funding. The country scaled up its social child grant program in 2010 and provided UBI to all the 3 million in the population. It was financed through copper prices that dramatically fell. So they had to start reducing transfer amounts up to 80% at a certain point, and then you had to stop it and go back to the old universal child grant. So it was in place for 2 years only. But in the process, there were some interesting developments, like the degree of financial inclusion that was promoted and achieved because of this, and also some poverty and inequality impacts. I know of only one paper that looked at this experience by Young and Howie, quite amazing. Country that has the longest UBI in place has one paper documenting it. Alaska had the scheme of their oil revenues and dividend in place for almost 40 years, 38 years, very much ingrained in the social contract. Also, this one is volatile. It gives between $1,000 and $2,000 a year. Between 1 year and the other, this varied by 20%. It has been widely documented in terms of employment effects by Ioana Marinescu, Jones, and others. And as I said, it really enjoys a lot of public support. There are surveys that show that people would be rather paying higher taxes than get the dividend taken out. Iran had the UBI for a very short time at the early stages of its subsidy reform in 2011. Then they gradually got the rich out of the scheme, so it's still very high coverage, over 90% of the population, but it's not really a UBI. Very generous, almost 30% of median income. Saleh Isfahani, Javad, and many others at Virginia Tech, just like in Alaska, assessed the no negative labor effects of the scheme. And the problem was inflation. It was not index linked to inflation, so 4/5 of the value was eroded because of that. As a mean of illustrating some of the trade-offs I mentioned, particularly around coverage and adequacy and costs, we ran a number of simulations in the chapter that Yamele led, including Nora and CU and Emma Monsalve. And here the idea is not to provide in-country depth assessments. Again, illustration on how outcomes may vary by the different configuration of social protection, the trade-offs, and considering both the benefit and the tax side of the equation. So we looked at 10 countries spanning across the income spectrum, each representing part of a typology of coverage and progressivity. And we see that for poverty-related purposes, that was the main lens through which we looked at the simulations. There are many other legitimate ones. If you take the main cash transfer schemes and PDS in the case of India, redistributed to the whole population, it has less than a poverty effect than the current system. This is data based on the square poverty gap, and you see that the current system is more effective everywhere except Russia, where the categorical transfer schemes are slightly regressive. So those at the bottom, particularly the young and the couples without children, and the singles are a little bit better off with the UBI. We looked at the number of, again, on the budget neutral scenario, distributional effects. In low-income countries, there is so little to redistribute that it's basically nil, like in Mozambique. But countries like Indonesia and Brazil that have invested so heavily in systems that try to reach those at the bottom, just taking that redistributing throughout the distribution may make those, the poorest decile, the one worse off. Russia, I mentioned. South Africa taking the generous support to the elderly, again, redistributing across the distribution, make that particular age group get hurt. Of course, there are more sizable poverty-reducing effects the moment that we give more generous transfers. If we take the equivalent benefits, the average size, and give it to everyone, or the poverty, an equivalent amount for the poverty gap, or the entire poverty line, we see sizable achievements here. But of course, they come, again, trade-offs at a cost. So for the equivalent benefits, it's about 2.4% on average. For the poverty gap, it's about 7.5 and 24% in the case of the poverty line on average, all driven mostly by the poorest countries. We also looked at possible domestic resource mobilization efforts on the taxation side. This is an illustration from India, and you look at the poverty gap effects, the UBI for equivalent to a poverty gap. You'll see that what would it take to finance it? So if they go for direct taxation, that would increase enormously the tax incidence on the poorest decile. You see up to 68%. This is a phenomenon very well documented by Hanna and Olken in a paper 2 years ago in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. It's basically the structure rate and taxation, direct taxes is so much at the top that it's very easy to increase the tax incidence up there. When it comes to the proportionate increase in indirect taxes, again, this would the middle class would see the taxes increased sizably, and also the scenario where we say, well, let's get the richest decile to pay for the entire bill. That would be so much that they would become like the second highest decile. So again, nothing is impossible, but it does point to the political economy challenges, and this kind of assessments also complement what Dave and Delphine did for the conversion of energy subsidies that would not be entirely enough to cover for this sort of scenario. Last 3 slides. One, the importance of the delivery system that I mentioned earlier. John Blomqvist is here. There is an entire chapter on the different phases of a typical stylized and highly simplified delivery chain that is here, phases of assessment, decision, and implementation. Would the UBI be easier or more difficult to implement? Well, there are some functions like deciding the eligibility and assessment needs and conditions that would be simpler, it's fair to say, with the UBI. Others would be under enormous pressure. The identification for the entire population, the payments. They need to have a social registry that now covers everyone. So all these building blocks would need to be in place for a UBI. Nothing is waived, but in general, it could be a little bit simpler than a typical scheme. Some final remarks. I'm told that you always need 4 letters to get the messages stick. So I tried with 4 C's. One is about context. So what can we say based on what we have humbly learned over these years? In context where you have social assistance that provides adequate benefits, high coverage, and is relatively progressive, perhaps it's not the case just to throw out the baby in the bathwater and look at what are the specific bottlenecks that hamper performance when it comes to poverty, or you could motivate the UBI differently. It could be for a social dividend, or it could be for the automation story. Where coverage is high but not progressive, UBI could be considered as an option. Some, and we show it, for example, for South Africa, but depends what you replace. Some groups may be hurt. Social assistance is limited but provided progressively. Indonesia and Brazil. If you remove that assistance to the bottom, those will be hurt. So it depends whether you're looking at UBI as a one-off intervention or if additional to other schemes. And where social assistance is patchy and flat or regressive, which is the case in many low-income countries, UBI could be an option, could help in expand coverage, but it would need progressive income taxation or the elimination of subsidies or windfall resources to be financed. Some of these are not always present in low-income countries. So there is an agenda here to think how to achieve universality progressively. But in some, oil-rich middle-income countries, those conditions may be in place. My final 3 Cs, one on communication. So be very clear about what you want to achieve and set the design accordingly. Sometimes the social dividends provide a very tiny amount. The social assistance is meant to provide much more. So what is it that we really want to achieve? It's interesting to note also as all pilots are called UBI pilots. None of the big countries called it a UBI. So there is something about the communication of it that's interesting. Thinks through the trade-offs. We identified 8 of those. But importantly, no single program scored perfectly across all those 8 dimensions. So the discussion is perhaps more nuanced and understanding across options which provides a more optimal equilibrium that the policymaker is interested in. And finally, we know so little on a number of dimensions. The behavioral responses, what happens really when there are these mass injections at household, firm, and markets level. What happens when we integrate it with pensions? What happens with the wages and minimum wages? Would the minimum wage be abolished because you have a UBI, or would it strengthen it? A lot of debates around those issues. Gauging the pipeline, the delivery pipeline ex ante. How solid is it? Can it sustain this kind of influx and pressures? And finally, my last point, we are learning so much from the pilots out there that are really helping in furthering the empirical agenda on a number of relevant questions. But there is really a need for the more kind of real-world understanding of what are the institutional choices, the political economy of reform of programs that are very hard to reform, and the domestic resource mobilization, as Teresa indicated in her chapter. So, added to C's here, copy for download, and contact please for any feedback and information.
Thank you very much, Ugo, for navigating us through very complex world. Now, to help further to navigate the terrain, we will have our panelists. We will go from my right to my left behind this table, not necessarily in views. And each of them will have 5 minutes, after which we open up for questions and discussion. And the first panelist would be Alex Huster from our friendly organization UNICEF. She's an associate director in the program division. Alex, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I thought I had 8, so let's see how I do. First of all, congratulations to the bank for putting together this really valuable and thoughtful piece on quite a hot topic, so hot that I'm hoping that I'm not going to get in trouble with the UN on the UN standards of conduct for getting involved in a political issue, especially given that Yang is quoted in the book, but it's okay. I'm sure it will be fine, and I'm really happy to be here. First, some context for my remarks. I'm coming at this from the side of social protection. I'm responsible for UNICEF's work on social policy, which includes our work on social protection as well as on public financial management. Our interest in social protection is not only about children, but about social protection systems overall. And that's because we know that everything that happens in the systems, even pensions, ultimately matter for children. How well those systems function is as much make or break as how specifically targeted at children the instruments may be. Though, of course, we are, of course, also interested in the instruments which are specifically targeted at children, and especially child grants or child benefits, as we're calling them now, which is referred to in the book and often seen as a quasi UBI. And I'll come back to that. It is useful for us to have as a thought experiment to look at UBIs from an overall systems perspective, but of course, in our case, always with a child lens. What is the ultimate impact on children? And I also thought it would be worth briefly sharing our insight on child grants, which are way more common than UBIs. According to the ILO, 107 countries have child grants on the books. So first, on the systems impact, there's an awful lot to like here, and that came out in your presentation. And of course, there are a few worries as well. On the plus side, in looking at the book itself, I really like the framework that you present for assessing the critical issues and trade-offs, the pinwheel. I want to add a spoke to it, though, if I can, which isn't really a trade-off, but something that I really hope that will be factored in as policymakers consider whether to take on or where to go with UBI. And that spoke is human capital. Surprising, it's coming from me. But we also, for UNICEF, another way of translating human capital is multidimensional poverty, right? So any calculation of the trade-offs should also take account of what's been added, not just the income that's been added, but are you getting better results in health, in education, where it reaches children, in living standards, on employment uptake, which comes up in the Alaska example, on, I'm sure, other inclusive growth indicators. And I guess these are encompassed in the overall objectives on poverty reduction, social dividend, response to automation. And I also know you can't measure it because it hasn't happened enough to be able to tell. But I just think it's important to keep into the equation as you advise countries on whether or not to go ahead, and looking at the costs as well. The book really usefully summarizes the positive aspects of universality. I like the slide, likely simpler but not simple. But I'd also add rather attractive. There are a few things that it helps to do to strengthen the system overall. Increasing registration, getting everybody into the tent, avoiding exclusion errors, and helping with social cohesion goals, kind of automatically. Reducing transaction costs, eliminating stigma, and the likelihood of greater political sustainability. Again, something we find with universal child grants. And all of these help the system itself to function better. Let me move on to some of the book's exploration of system challenges. So what's not to like in a UBI, as my grandmother might say, except the UBI part. The cost above all, of course. And here I really love how much the book gets into the revenue side and the role of taxation. And in fact, there were some times ago where you referred to it as flat, but then showed how taxation, which of course will always be there, can quickly make a UBI progressive, as well as being used as a funding tool. So having that very high in the dialogue is also really helpful. I have to say, as I read through the book, I got a red flag I had not thought about, which is that children might be excluded. That if why would you ever do that? But if it is structured purely as income replacement, you throw the babies out with the bathwater. And clearly there are risks here, and not just because I'm from UNICEF, but for all of your interest from the perspective of the World Bank. Children are poorer than adults, right, Carolina? As our joint World Bank UNICEF poverty analysis clearly shows, children are twice as likely as adults to live in extreme poverty. They're also poorly covered by social protection. So according to a recent publication we did together with the ILO, 8 times as much social protection expenditure is on older adults as compared to children. And of course, the human capital goals of social protection would be very much at risk if children were excluded. I was also glad that the book has these clear reminders that UBI would not automatically level the playing field. In fact, it really can't do this, and all of us working on social protection know this quite quite clearly. And so thanks for spelling it out. I know this is going to be very obvious to all of you, but of course, equal access to quality services matters, and this may be especially true for children, but it matters for everyone. And the way we see it, household financial barriers are only one reason that people don't access services. How those services are funded, to the public finance side, matters immensely, and how they are organized. So a UBI is not going to give you quality education or clean water or affordable preschool. And here, this is where I got really spooked by the idea of a UBI replacing all forms of social assistance, or even beyond that, even services you mentioned. I mean, given the multifaceted needs that anyone has, that's clearly will not take us very far. So, thank you for showing that. Maybe we even have to say it more clear, out loud and in any further documentation you do on this. So let me turn now to child benefits, that UBI subset, and a few comments on what we know. First of all, many of the characteristics are the same in just describing what you mean by a universal child benefit, that it's universal, unconditional, goes to everybody under a certain age. And I should mention that we have quite parallel work going on. We're just a few months behind you on doing we're calling it a paper, but actually it's going to be the length of a book, with ODI, looking at the same issues of trade-offs, benefits, options, and models on universal child benefits. We're doing this with ODI. The co-author is Francesca Bastagli, who's one of the co-authors of this book. And that will, and we've had lots of input from our friends here at the bank. We'll be launching that in April. I hope that we can have many of you there, perhaps at the Financing for Development Forum. So what's worth considering from the child benefits experience when we're thinking about UBI? Keeping in mind what I said before, 107 countries have them in some form. So first of all, one thing we know, they work. Even for reducing poverty, not just for inequality. I mean, that's from evidence from 15 OECD countries. Let me not overstate the case. For poorer countries, it may be more complex. Some of the work that's done in our study is looking also at universal child grants, which are not universal because they're means tested. But one of the findings there is that the more means tested, the less poverty and inequality reduction you have. We see improved non-monetary outcomes for children. So back to those human capital arguments, a greater uptake of education and health, less clear on some of those other final outcomes, but we know an awful lot about this from all the research that the bank and many have done on cash transfers. We know that it helps avoid stigma. We know that the political economy issues that UBI raises come up as well with child benefits, that it creates public support because it's for everybody. And we also know that the costs, that it works in wealthier countries, but for extending universal child benefits in lower income countries, it's still a massive financial challenge to look at. Beyond these from our evidence review, beyond the points from the evidence review, just a couple of points I wanted to make. It may be, the fear that I showed about a UBI excluding children, it may well be worth considering how would a UBI and child grants work together if you had one that were separate. And it's important also to recognize the different purpose that they serve. That in addition to supporting the human capital developments and the well-being of children and their human rights, may I add, that it also offsets the costs of child rearing on the parents and that universal public good that they are contributing. So my final kind of summary points that I wanted to leave you with. Child grants offer lessons for the UBI policy debates and entry points for actually beginning them. And that's something that we should as this moves forward, because it's certainly not going away, it's something that we should really keep an eye on and perhaps work on together. As UBI is further explored, I hope that we'll all give greater thought and work to measure impacts beyond poverty and inequality reduction to the tangible improvements that it might have in people's lives and the links with services, the human capital potential that might be unleashed. It is really so useful to keep the taxation side of the coin visible and understandable, and I hope that that will continue to be a part of the debate, and the potential for something that looks flat to be progressive, I think, is an important thing to continue to communicate. And finally, do no harm. There are grave risks in putting all eggs in one basket. I think that's obvious to all of us, whether it's the exclusion of children to defunding of services. None of that could end well. UBI seem to make the most sense as part of a broader, well-functioning system, and that's a conclusion that one seems to draw from the book as well as the presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and I am very grateful to you that you mentioned human capital. As we make a claim that social safety nets very often have a very positive impact on human capital, and because this impact sometimes happens because of conditionality, sometimes happens because of targeting, obviously many of us would be very much concerned that having that system replaced by UBI would not be helpful for human capital buildup. That's, I think, the bottom line where we are at the moment. Let's now move to our second panelist from across the street, David Cody, Division Chief in the Expenditure Policy Division in the IMF. David.
Thank you very much to World Bank colleagues for letting me be part of this discussion. I think it's an issue we've discussed a lot over recent years. If I'm from the fund, you know somewhere along this conversation it's going to be linked back implicitly or explicitly to a budget constraint. So the free lunch now over. Yeah. But I also want to maybe pick up a little bit of where you left off at financing and do no harm, not just being important to keep there, but there is no conversation without that. Yeah. But I think this is a good example, this book, at the bank doing one of the things the banks does really well. A really comprehensive evaluation assessment, not even an evaluation from different perspectives, without coming down on one side or another, which sets out the trade-offs. So a very balanced discussion in that of a lot of issues, bringing people in from outside the bank, outside that community, to work on these. So very comprehensive on issues and views. So congratulations on that. I think it is something that you do really well and hopefully continue to do. In our own work at the IMF, it has recently been a growing focus of our analytical work. You know, we had a fiscal monitor in autumn 2017 on tackling inequality, which raised the issue, as you might think, on side by side with the issue of progressivity of taxation and stuff like that. So that was maybe one of the first for us to be so explicit about terms like UBI and where it fits in, but also in our operational work. As I was coming in, someone from the bank just grabbed my arm and said, in this particular country, the issue of UBI is coming up, and we need to talk very heavily to you guys on the other side of the street. So operationally, it's coming into play a lot more, our variants of that. And I think this is great. I think this is bringing a debate. You know, one of the things social protection people are very proud of now is you have your own SDG. Yeah, you didn't have an SDG before. So it's putting it up there, and we all are at the bank fund, of course, will cost it at some stage or other. Yeah. So thank you very much. So I want to take up a little bit on the financing, do no harm. I'll try and touch on that. And some of the key issues to remind us again what we need to look at and to maybe push the discussion forward. But the UBI, we've been talking implicitly about the UBI since the 70s. And I mean implicitly in explicit models. Either when we're talking about fiscal redistribution or social protection design. The optimal income taxation literature of the mid-70s, which took us a decade to try and understand, that literature, at the core of that model, is a UBI. Maybe not the B, but a UI, Universal Transfer, UT. Yeah? It says, give everyone a lump sum transfer, and now let's look at a nice sophisticated income tax schedule. And out of that comes the optimal tax and transfer scheme is where you have high marginal tax, a lump sum transfer, high marginal tax rates at the top, low marginal tax rates in the middle where everybody is for efficiency, and let's say medium marginal tax rates at the top of the income distribution. That's a lump sum transfer where we never talked about financing, but when you put financing into it, it becomes a combination of three things. It becomes a combination of a GMI program at the bottom with tapering, marginal income taxes, but a consumption tax is a proportional income tax in the middle of the income distribution. And at the top, you have the value-added tax or the consumption tax, but you have a progressive income tax system because we also need income taxes to get back the income that wasn't consumed and may never be consumed and maybe was never paid tax on and so on. So they're the key ingredients of an optimal income tax system, and the UT is at the heart of that. So we've always been talking about that, and I've always been a bit surprised in audiences where people who do optimal income taxation then get very emotional about a UBI, and okay, that's a bit strange. Now, of course, it then tells us it's semantics. I can describe the system from the tax side, the transfer side, or the net tax side. And it tells us you do not talk about one without the other. It's not a complete conversation in any way, and possibly not at all a useful conversation to do one without the other. Let's take advanced countries. They more or less have all those instruments. GMI programs, consumption taxes, progressive income taxes. So the instruments are there. So in some sense, when you have all of these instruments, you may not buy very much from a UBI, and I think a lot of the numbers you're putting out there are suggesting that. Be careful how you rationalize the UBI in those contexts. But also, let's bring in one of the dimensions, which is not just the standard social protection world or social assistance world, maybe more the social insurance world, that if you think the UBI is there as part of a need to address increasing uncertainty and volatility of incomes, I could say employment too, but incomes, well then that seems to me to point towards even more progressive tax and transfer systems. A progressive tax and transfer systems is one of the best maybe insurance instruments out there where volatility of income is across the income distribution. So we have been talking about this for a long time. We maybe didn't realize it. I did some simulation from some guy's model and just to see what was for some parameters, what was the level of the transfer relative to median income, and it was over 40%, so close enough to a B in a UBI. Yeah. So that's the first thing I wanted to just point out there, that we have been implicitly discussing this. So the next thing then I wanted to talk about is developing countries. What is the key challenge in developing countries? And this is where I think the big discussion for me is going. I think we more or less have something that looks like a UBI in many advanced countries, and you can describe it differently or do it differently and so on and so forth, but we're very close to it in one form or another, especially if you take into account other transfers, in-kind transfers like education, which tend to be universal. Okay. So to me, the big issue is really down in developing countries. I'm jumping over everything in between advanced and developing and calling them all developing. What's the big issue here? Well, they have consumption taxes, although a lot of people are worried about consumption taxes from some angle. But the consumption tax is the engine of revenue mobilization in the short run for these countries. Is it not an option to do anything unless you enhance consumption taxes? So not part of a real life conversation if you don't talk about them. Income taxes is another part. If you look at standard IMF fiscal affairs device, strengthen consumption taxes, broaden the base, I'll talk about that in a minute, broaden the base, but keep your eye on income taxation and start at the top, have good exemption thresholds and so on and so forth. Start at the top because that's the only way you can get at the top. Consumption taxes won't get at there because income is greater than consumption and maybe forever for these people. Yeah. So you really have to keep your eye on that and develop it over time. So already part of standard advice, income taxing. The bottom end is where the action is. It's the difficulty for low-income countries to implement means-tested programs. This is the big issue to me in developing countries. It is really not possible in a lot of them to do at this stage because of informality. Informality is a very crude term, but it's really about the idea that you've got low levels of education, low levels of bookkeeping, multiple sources of income, multiple sources of volatile income. It's just really difficult to be doing it, and you'd be taking it off, you'd be doing it to get very little revenue and put stress on the administration. So consumption taxes are there. But it's the inability to do that. Consumption taxes broaden the base. The concern is if your existing system of social safety nets has low coverage in these countries, do no harm is not possible with consumption taxes. Yeah? So it's really the need to strengthen the safety net where you have coverage at the bottom, whatever bottom is for people. I don't think we should get too caught up on the poverty line or whatever, and even the bank now, you do 40% or whatever. Across the income distribution, make sure you have coverage. That is the big challenge. And a UBI is an interesting conversation in that context. With coverage at the bottom, you can ensure that you can protect them not just from fiscal reforms like consumption taxes, which are the revenue engine in the short term, but also other structural reforms that you want to do and that are crucial for the growth. And without growth, we're going nowhere with additional poverty issues or relative poverty issues. So all of that has to be part of the discussion. In that sense, the safety net is an efficiency instrument to enable you to do those reforms. And if you want to broaden the consumption taxes, you can do things like give exemptions, but you're really not achieving much. Consumption taxes are either slightly progressive or slightly regressive. It's not worth talking about the difference in that sense. It's a technical discussion that is not very useful. It's coverage at the bottom of the safety net that matters. UBI can bring us there. UBI, but what does the optimal income tax literature tell us? If you go for a full UBI with a sizable amount of money, you better make sure you have an efficient and progressive tax system. That should be consumption taxes, which are like income taxes in the middle of the income distribution. You should put a lot of weight on developing over time your income tax system, and a really good efficient source of revenue that is administratively feasible in these countries is efficient taxation of fossil fuel subsidies and maybe a few other sorts of excises. So the agenda, as I described, is not, we could have never mentioned the word UBI and have had 80% of that agenda. But the UBI then brings us to the world of how can we get there? I saw Jean Drez's picture up here somewhere. And so let me I think we should clarify some things. Jean Drez and Sen and these people, they're not against the UBI. If you read their paper, they say they are not against the UBI. They're against the nature of the conversation and the narrow conversation around a UBI. One of their biggest concerns is political, that it's just an agenda for getting rid of all the programs in India, for example. But at the heart of that is income is not the only thing that matters in interventions. When you have programs which are conditioned, now it's the CCT programs, but we've always had lots of nutrition programs where you don't just give income, you give information about nutrition, you give other support linking up. The big fear of a lot of people is you will crowd out that these are the programs, not just because you won't really give them the income in the end, but you'll give them only the income. And I think this is really, if you read what they're saying, this is what they are concerned about. It's not the UBI. And a part of that crowd out is also when you see the fiscal cost of it. Yeah? Now, just to then, I kind of wrap up a little bit, that I think the conversation is about how to get at the bottom. That brings in you to your world of progressive universalism. Child benefits, means tested is difficult. Proxy means testing, maybe less difficult, maybe more feasible, but at the bottom of the income distribution, there's a big discussion going on out there, and I think we have to make it very explicit about proxy means test at the bottom of the income distribution and the amount of leakage and undercoverage. Yeah, and when you introduce social and political issues, it should make us think about it and be very explicit about the nature of our arguments. Now, of course, proxy means tested programs are typically not the only program in the system, so some of the issues will be removed when you think of the other systems. If you're going for other ways of doing it, child benefit, social pensions, which should, we all love children, even at the fund. Yeah. The elderly, not so sure, but we'll hang in with the elderly. Yeah, give them the pensions. So they're politically always used and can buy a lot of. One of the things we did for India was to show how you can buy a lot of coverage with these programs. You still may want to supplement proxy means if you're still having difficulty covering, or you can combine them. So it's important to look at the system. But the conversation has to, and if UBI, if you're putting in place efficient energy taxes, good consumption taxes, and if you're really able to strengthen your income tax, you'll take back a lot of the child benefits and the universal anything at the top end. And we should worry less about it. And the optimal income tax system told us that many years ago. We should not worry about the universal part if you have the other parts in place. So I think that's where we need to look at coverage, and progressive universalism is where a lot of common ground is. Let's strengthen the safety nets and ensure coverage at the bottom of the distribution. It's efficient as well as equitable. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, David. I really like your focus on social safety nets coverage and looking at social safety net as an efficiency instrument. That's maybe a useful moment to advertise that we are planning a public event, open public event during spring meetings, which would be focused on how to unleash the potential of cash transfers by scaling them up. And David's intervention made it clear that we can cast it both in terms of social justice, but very much in terms of efficiency, especially in developing countries. You are now coming back to our institution, to our third panelist, Carolina Sanchez, our Global Director for Poverty and Equity Global Practice. Carol, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Real pleasure to be here. And I'm going to start with a bit of a disclaimer and then go into my comments. And I was chatting with Margaret about this before we started. And that's basically just sort of a reflection on my personal perspective on this discussion. And a part of me feels that the discussion to date about the UBI has been a little bit like the discussion on the top 1%. That is something that has been very driven by, I think, the preoccupation in developed countries about some of the issues and challenges that are emerging there, but that somehow has ended up dominating some of our conversations in the developing context, and in many cases being a distraction. And I think the reason why that has been the case is because that conversation, as David pointed out, has been very frequently narrow and not nuanced enough. So in that context, I actually think this book is a great contribution, because being skeptical and somewhat annoyed about the way that this conversation has gone at points, I was really pleased as I was reading the book, because I think it does three things and it does them very well. The first one is that it's very systematic and objective in the way it approaches the debate and the discussion. It's timely, as I think everybody has pointed out. And I think it focuses on the right things that are, first, it takes stock of what we know and what we don't know. So again, it starts to bring some nuance into the conversation. I think it really helps us to understand what's the evidence and how we can use it to make decisions rather than prescribing what needs to be done. So a lot of what the book does is sort of give you decision trees that allow you to think about where you are as a country or where you are as a government, and therefore what are the kinds of choices that you're facing. And then, and this is very welcome, I think it sort of takes the conversation to the developing context, and then it really talks about what the real issues are there. So very well done. Really congratulations to the team, because I think we really needed something like this. And so with that in mind, I want to sort of say, and now I'm going to put sort of my poverty hat on, I'll say a few things about the idea of universality. Then I'll talk a little bit about cash, but in a way I feel like a lot of what I wanted to say was already mentioned. And then I'll go back to this idea of basic. What does basic mean? In terms of amounts. So I confess that I continue to struggle with the idea of universality. And, and I know what the arguments are, but none of those arguments, and I think the book does a very good job in sort of reviewing those arguments, none of them, to me, is persuasive enough in the case of a developing country. And let me tell you a little bit why, and this is in the spirit of having a conversation afterwards. So you hear arguments around the lines of, fairness, guaranteeing a minimal level of well-being, etc. But to me, those arguments go in the direction of the outcomes discussion, the example that you had on everybody has to be reading at a certain level, rather than in the line of universal, right? So that, to me, doesn't quite cut it. So that would make me think much more of programs like guaranteed basic minimum income rather than a universal. And I think if you look back to economics and you look at any sort of social welfare function, what that would tell you is that the social planner would want to allocate your marginal dollar to those that are at the bottom of the distribution, not necessarily uniformly. So somehow that argument to me doesn't really cut it in terms of why would you not want to focus on the poor or whoever your bottom of the distribution is. Then there's the second argument of, well, we are moving into a world where robots are taking over, jobs will be scarce, so you need a way of compensating people. And that might be a valid argument, but if I think about your average African country, who's compensating who? I mean, what's the argument? I mean, those countries are not going to go through the same paths as the developed countries of today. So the debate is not really whether those that now have jobs need to compensate those that don't have them. So to me, frankly, if you take that argument to the extreme, and maybe this is a little bit provocative, that's a rationale for thinking of a UBI at the global level and to think about, who needs to compensate who, and is this really sort of a redistribution across countries? I know that's not what we are talking about, but again, to me, that it's a different conversation. And then, there's the argument of the dividend, which I actually think is a very valid one, but it only applies to very few countries and only if you have the capacity to manage the natural resource rents adequately. And, I think both the Alaska and the Mongolia examples illustrate the challenges doing that. So that whole sort of fairness rationale somehow, to me, is not convincing. Then there's the argument of the political economy. Okay, so you put fairness aside, but if you want to transfer resources to the bottom of the distribution, you need to have your middle class on board. You need to have your richer sort of part of the society on board. So therefore, just make it universal, and then somehow they'll buy into it. But I think what the book illustrates very clearly is that unless this is a country that is already spending a significant amount of resources on safety nets, and therefore what you are thinking about doing is sort of budget neutral, the moment that you're in the space of having to mobilize additional resources, that political economy argument just collapses because the same people that you're trying to convince are very likely to end up footing a lot of the bill of having these programs in place, as David was saying. And you can play around with your taxation structure, but the reality is either on the one hand, you are undoing everything that you are trying to do at the bottom of the distribution, or you end up with those groups that you're trying to attract having to pay for it. So again, I don't quite see the political economy argument. And I think, like others, I want to echo the praise for the fiscal analysis, because I think that's critical in giving that holistic perspective of the issue. And then there's sort of the logistics argument, right? Saying, look, this just simplifies things. It will minimize the inclusion and exclusion errors because, we don't have good targeting mechanisms. Just give it to everybody and make sure that all the poor get it. And that may be true in some cases, particularly if what you're doing is replacing existing programs rather than adding more complexity to the landscape of programs, although that itself has some programs. But I think if you don't address the implementation challenges that your traditional safety nets may be facing in terms of reaching the poor, this is not necessarily a recipe for that. So I think, and again, the book acknowledges that, but this is just to say that I think to me there's still a big question, particularly in the developing country context, around the question of universality. So I just wanted to put that there. On the issue of cash, and this is not exclusively about the UBI, Alex already mentioned that poverty is multidimensional, and we also know that there's huge overlaps between sort of monetary poverty and non-monetary poverty. So people traditionally struggle with multiple constraints, not just not having money, but also not having access to basic services, etc. So moving to a system that is primarily cash-based, I think could be most effective in environments where a series of conditions need to be in place at the same time. And the book, again, acknowledges all of this, but just to sort of put it on the table. You need inflation to be low, because otherwise the value of this money, it's eroded very quickly. You need markets to work well, because if you're putting money in people's hands, you want to be able, you want to make sure that they can use it to buy food or to buy services or do anything else. You at least have to ensure that public service provision is universal and of sufficient quality, again, especially if you're taking away some of those programs to give cash. And then finally, and this is an important point, and David alluded to this, in a way, you are kind of assuming that there's perfect information and the right behaviors, particularly among the poor, and the vulnerable if you are going to, again, take away a lot of those complementary interventions that some programs have in terms of providing information and nudging behaviors via conditionalities or other issues. And in the absence of these conditions, and I think the book does acknowledge this, UBI could actually exacerbate other inequalities, including in service provision, and it could exacerbate situations where there's rationing or inflationary pressure. So again, something to take into account in terms of what's the context, not just in the safety net landscape, but more broadly in the economy where these programs are being implemented. And then finally, on this issue of basic, and I don't really have any answer, so I wonder if you guys thought a little bit about this. Because I think we tend to think about basic in terms of, give them kind of the value of the poverty line or, some very sort of minimum amount of income, which may be fine. But, we know that many countries in the world have poverty lines that are extremely low. They're national poverty lines. And our conversation with them is, look, this doesn't really even guarantee that somebody can meet their basic needs. So is that really the standard that we want to sort of aim for? And if it's something higher, then what is it? I mean, is it a minimum decent wage? What does that mean? Is it something else? And then what does that mean then for issues of affordability and then disincentives? So this is more a question for you, because I'm sure you sort of thought a little bit about this, and it's a relevant question that I think comes up in the discussion. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Carol. We have 15 minutes for discussion, questions. There are two mics. One is over there on my left, one is on my right. If you would like to make a comment, make it short. If you would like to ask a question, also make it short, and introduce yourselves when doing either of the above. Please.
I think Carol alluded to this, but knowing that it may be hard to finance a lot of these programs, particularly in the lower income context, did you guys consider looking at sort of the possibility of a Global Universal Basic Income, GUBI, I don't know if that's a good acronym, but yeah, some system for financing between countries.
Thank you. We take a few questions before we come back, so please.
Yes. Hi, Maria Maitali-Sliman, FCI MENA. My question is about countries that need to phase out universal energy or food subsidies. Do you think that UBI would be the solution for these kind of countries?
Next one, please.
Hi, Holly Radice from CARE. I heard us talk about children. I heard us talk about elderly. I heard us talk about people that may not be nationals of the country, but I didn't hear us anything about gender, and it's not coming up at all in terms of practice and evidence. So I'm just curious what you want to add to that.
Thank you. Please, next.
I'm Per Korowski, used to be executive director for Venezuela here way back. I come to universal basic income from the revenue sharing point of view. And in that, for me, unconditional and universal are basic elements, because that eliminates the redistribution profiteers from it all and really makes it a citizen-to-citizen affair and not a political-driven affair. That, to me, is sort of a fundamental thing. Imagine if my country had had oil revenue sharing, universal basic income 50 years ago. Imagine if Iraq had adopted the oil sharing revenue proposal that was in place early 2000.
Thank you very much. There are no further questions now, so I plan to do the following. I plan to turn to the panelists and Margaret, asking them whether they would like to make any comment based on your questions, and then also plead to them make your intervention short. And finally, we move back to Hugo for his last word. So first, the question to the panelists and Margaret. Okay. I have one.
Okay, go. Just one, because it touches on a topic that I am involved in, which is someone mentioned energy subsidy reform, which always gets me excited, and someone also talked about it in the context of natural resources and redistribution of rents from natural resources. Energy subsidy reform, if you have to buy, in my own view, is if you have to buy energy subsidy reform with anything that looks like a UBI, partial, I don't think you have to just talk about UBI, with a common transfer of some sort, I would sign up personally tomorrow. And it's not just because of the global good, but most of the benefits of energy subsidy reform are at the national level. And if you're a believer, which I am more and more these days, that you're not going anywhere without getting the price right when it comes to fossil fuels, or not fast enough and not big enough, then you have to consider that as a very, very feasible and workable instrument. Variations on it, of course. And if you believe the global environment and the national environment is a common good, and maybe give that money back to us all. So.
Alex, please.
Yeah, just on the gender issue. I mean, of course, we certainly know with universal child grants that all cash transfers to families with children can help create the possibility for women to work. There's several potential positive impacts depending on the design that they can and often do have, but also that those impacts are always stronger when the services are there. So it comes back to some of the arguments we were all making, really, that you can't expect money to do everything. That money can help, and it's definitely not enough. I'm not sure, I can't recall if there's more analysis of it in the book, and I'm sure that the authors will speak to that about UBI.
Thank you. So back to you, Ugo.
Thank you very much. This is just a few thoughts. I think I agree with David that the discussion has been there since the 70s, but I would say it's from the 1570s. From the road to Spinham Land and how English parishes were starting financing the first GMI that was introduced in 1795. So it's, we have about 500 years or so of debate. On gender and human capital, just a clarification, and points were taken. We didn't simulate them, but there is a lot of discussion, especially in Chapter 1, on the effect of cash transfers and on gender. Alessandra, I think, is here in the room, Aline and others, and human capital with Lara. I think we make very clear a little bit the whole theory of change of cash there. We just didn't simulate them. The global UBI, the Carolina's fund now, that's the way we're going to call it. It's nice that you started as a skeptic and ended up with a global fund on UBI. It's like, I think Michael Kishon actually was faster than you. I think a couple of weeks ago he proposed a global fund for social protection.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
So the former department director from the ILO of social protection.
I stop it here.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to an end. Thank you very much for your active participation and for being here. And biggest thanks for the authors, editors of the guide, and our panelists.